The Christmas Morning Church Mystery Vertical Bar, a Miss Marple Mystery. Chapter 1. The village of St. Mildred-sun-Glen had always prided itself on its quiet decency, modest gardens, orderly hedgerows, and an annual Christmas service that drew nearly every soul from miles around. This year's was to be particularly fine. The frost lay like spun sugar over the green, and the ancient church bells tolled with a warmth that promised peace, if not joy, to the sleepy Sussex countryside. Inside St. Mildred's Church, the air was scented with pine garlands and beeswax polish. Candles flickered in brass sconces, casting long shadows over the carved pews and the old oak pulpit. The choir, mostly volunteers from the Women's Guild, and the postmistress' grandchildren gathered by the organ loft, tuning their voices with the quiet hum of familiarity. Among the early arrivals was Miss Jane Marple of Church Lane, wearing a neatly pressed navy coat and carrying a sprig of holly pinned to her muff. She nodded kindly to the vicar, Reverend Amos Kettle, and took her usual seat, third pew from the front right-hand side, directly beneath the window of St. Michael and the Dragon. She always liked to observe people arriving. There was Mr. George Lytton, retired solicitor, shaking snow from his sleeves, Miss Clara Winchell, clutching her hymn book as if it might ward off gossip, and the Blenkinsop twins, who had not spoken to each other since last March over a dispute involving the flower rota. All the ordinary tensions tucked beneath well-worn hats and scarves. But it was the arrival of Mr. Ambrose Pollock, newly moved to the village just a month prior, that caused a slight stir. Dashing in his long black coat, with a white streak in his hair and the faintest accent no one could quite place, Mr. Pollock had quickly become the subject of polite speculation. He was alone as usual, and sat in the fifth pew on the left. Several ladies in the congregation angled themselves discreetly to glance his way. "Isn't it?" whispered Mrs. Weatherby to her neighbour, "how no one really knows what he does." "American money, I heard," the neighbour replied, lips barely moving. Miss Marple heard neither, but she did notice Mr. Pollock wince slightly as he knelt, an old injury perhaps, and the way he placed his gloves carefully on the pew beside him. He bowed his head in prayer, and Miss Marple, glancing once more at the congregation, turned her gaze to the altar. All was serene. The service began promptly at 10. It was a lovely affair. Scriptures read crisply, carols sung in harmony, and a soft snowfall visible beyond the stained glass windows. Reverend Kettle gave a sermon on forgiveness and renewal, and Mrs. Alderney played in the bleak midwinter with such reverence that even the most cynical among the congregation felt a genuine flicker of Christmas spirit. Then came the blessing. Heads bowed, the congregation murmured along. But just as the vicar lifted his arms to speak the final words, "Go in peace, to love and serve the Lord," a quiet commotion began to ripple from the fifth pew. It was subtle at first. A dropped book, perhaps. Then someone gasped. "Is he asleep?" came a soft voice, followed by another sharper. "Someone fetch Dr. Anstruther, now." All eyes turned to Mr. Ambrose Pollock. He sat slumped forward, his chin on his chest. His gloves had fallen to the floor. One hand dangled oddly over the side of the pew, pale and unmoving. Miss Marple was on her feet before anyone else. She moved without fuss or fluster, already making her way toward the body as Dr. Anstruther arrived from the rear of the church, pushing through the stunned crowd with his medical bag. The examination was swift. The doctor straightened, lips pressed in a line. "I'm afraid Mr. Pollock has passed away," he said. "Most likely a heart attack. A collective murmur broke out, voices hushed in respect but crackling with surprise. "A dreadful shame," said the vicar, hands clasped tightly. "On Christmas morning, no less." Miss Marple didn't speak. She was looking not at Mr. Pollock, but at the gloves on the floor. One lay palm up. The other, curiously, had a faint smear of something on the inner wrist. Something like resin? Outside, the bells began to ring again, gently. This time, no one left the church quickly. The organ stopped. The choir filed out slowly, and Miss Marple remained standing by the fifth pew, eyes fixed not on the body, but on the space beneath the bench, where something small and dark glinted faintly in the light. She said nothing, but the thought had already occurred to her. People don't usually die sitting up quite so straight or quite so silently. And they certainly don't do it with that expression, frozen halfway between surprise and fear. Chapter 2. The vicarage always smelled faintly of pipe smoke and old hymnals, but today the air held something else, unease. By mid-afternoon, a modest gathering had formed at Reverend Kettle's house, ostensibly for a late Christmas tea. The invitations had not been formal, but in St. Mildred's Sun Glen, news moved faster than telegrams. A death at the morning service was enough to nudge even the most reluctant villagers toward the kettle and scones. Miss Marple arrived precisely at 3. Wearing the same navy coat, a tartan scarf tucked neatly beneath the collar. She was greeted by Mrs. Kettle, a brisk woman with a talent for damp sponge cakes and nervous smiles. "We didn't think, well, that is, given the morning sits happening," Mrs. Kettle said breathlessly. "But the scones were already made, you see." "Quite right," Miss Marple nodded. Grief never stopped an English tea from being poured. Inside the sitting room, the atmosphere was oddly buoyant, as if no one quite knew how to behave. Mrs. Weatherby spoke in tones just above a whisper, while Mr. Lytton helped himself to a third cucumber sandwich with the absent expression of a man digesting both food and shock. "It starts terrible. Simply terrible," Clara Winchell murmured to the room. "He just died in the middle of the service." "A heart attack, surely," offered Dr. Anstruther, seated awkwardly on a footstool, teacup in hand. "Clean death. Quick. At least there sits." Miss Marple took her tea without sugar, listening. "It was his face that got me," said Mrs. Alderney, who had arrived late and had taken up position by the hearth. "Frozen, like he said seen something, well, not pleasant." "Really, Hetty," snapped Mrs. Weatherby, "don't stop being morbid." But Miss Marple's eyes remained steady on the flames. She hadn't forgotten the faint smear on the glove, or the peculiar expression Mr. Pollock had worn, neither peaceful nor pained, but startled, too startled for someone simply meeting his end. "Did anyone know him well?" she asked lightly, breaking a lull in the conversation. The room hesitated. Even the vicar paused mid-pour. "He was renting the old Tithe cottage," said Mrs. Kettle after a moment. "Moved in around All Saints' Set Day. Kept to himself. I saw him at the grocer's." Mr. Lytton added. "Bought tinned fish and those expensive cigarettes. Bit of a recluse." "Rumour said he was once an actor," Clara said, voice low, conspiratorial, or something like it. "Always had that look, like he was waiting for applause." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "And did he entertain visitors?" There was a pause. Then Mrs. Alderney piped up. "There was one woman, tall, wore gloves, always, came twice that I saw. Brown car. Do you suppose she'll come forward now?" asked Mrs. Weatherby. "If she hasn't already," murmured Miss Marple, mostly to herself. Dr. Anstruther cleared his throat. "Frankly, I'm surprised the constable hasn't come by yet. These things usually take some questioning, but I expect it still be filed under natural causes. I saw no marks, no wounds, clean." "Poison can be clean," Miss Marple said gently. That earned a silence, so crisp it seemed to crackle in the air. "But there's no evidence of that, is there?" the doctor said stiffly. "Not unless someone knows what to look for," she replied, sipping her tea, "and knows where to look." Reverend Kettle coughed. "I do hope, Miss Marple, that you not suggesting this was something sinister." "I never suggest," she said mildly. "I observe." And indeed, she'd observed Mr. Pollock's precise punctuality to services, but never his participation in village life. She'd noticed his nervous glances during hymns, as if scanning the crowd, and now, with the memory of that small glint beneath the pew fresh in her mind, a dozen quiet suspicions stirred like dust behind a curtain. As if summoned by tension, there came a knock at the front door. A moment later, Constable Neil Whitcomb stepped in, hat under one arm, expression apologetic. "Afternoon, all," he said, with a nod. "Terribly sorry to disturb, but I sep a few questions to ask. Routine, of course." "Of course," said Reverend Kettle, guiding him in. The constable's questions were brief, logistical. Who sat near Mr. Pollock? Had anyone spoken to him that morning? Did he seem ill? Was anything unusual noted? Most shook their heads. A few offered vague recollections. He was quiet, looked pale. Nothing out of the ordinary. Miss Marple said little, and her turn passed with little notice. But as the constable prepared to leave, she spoke again. "Did anyone retrieve the items from Mr. Pollock's pew?" "Just the gloves, master," said Constable Whitcomb. "They sex with the body now." "Nothing beneath the bench? No dropped possessions?" The young constable frowned. "Didn't notice anything, but I can check." She nodded. Sometimes the smallest things get kicked just out of sight. And as he departed again, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the shimmer she had seen. She had not imagined it. Something had been left behind. Later that evening, back at her neat little cottage, Miss Marple stood by the fire with a cup of warm milk in her hand. Outside, the snow continued, blanketing the village in stillness, but the peace was uneasy, the silence too deep. She thought of Mr. Pollock's expression, the smear on the glove, the unknown woman, and above all, the curious fact that no one had ever really known who he was. Strangers sometimes arrived in small villages. They were usually escaping something: grief, disgrace, or a name better left unspoken. Miss Marple sipped her milk. It would not be long, she suspected, before something else came to light. Chapter 3. The day after Christmas dawned grey and dull, with a sky like damp wool, and a persistent drizzle softening the frost into slush. It was the kind of day best spent near a fire, but Miss Marple, wrapped in a thick shawl and rubber boots, had other ideas. She made her way across the green toward Old Tithe Cottage, Mr. Pollock's lodgings, unhurried but attentive, her cane tapping gently on the wet cobblestones. The cottage sat at the edge of the village, just beyond the vicarage, with ivy climbing up its crooked chimney and windows that blinked like sleepy eyes behind lace curtains. A constable stood at the gate. Not young Whitcomb, but Sergeant Beale from Much Norley, brought in for official handling of the death. "Good morning, Sergeant," Miss Marple said cheerfully. Terribly dreary day for inquiries. "Morning, Miss Marple," he replied, tipping his cap. "We stir just cataloguing the gentleman's 6 things. Coroner 6 ordered a closer look. Might not have been as natural a passing as first thought." "Really? I suppose Dr. Anstruther-Sip's opinion wasn't it quite conclusive then? Let's just say we started keeping an open mind." Beale hesitated. There was a small injury to the inside of the mouth, barely a scratch, but odd enough to note. "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. "I see." Beale cleared his throat. "You wouldn't be here to interfere, I hope?" "Certainly not. I merely thought to bring some shortbread to Mrs. Havers, his housekeeper. Death unsettles more than the deceased." The sergeant softened. "Right you are. Poor woman sits inside, packing what little she had lent him." Miss Marple entered the cottage and found Mrs. Havers at the hearth, folding towels into a worn satchel. Her hands trembled, though her face remained set. "Miss Marple," she said tightly, "strange times." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "You must have known Mr. Pollock better than most." Mrs. Havers paused. He was polite, paid on time, kept to himself. "Did he ever receive letters?" "Rarely. A few envelopes marked from London. He burned most straight away." "And visitors?" Mrs. Havers hesitated. "Just the one woman, tall, well-dressed, came twice. She never gave a name." "Did he seem troubled after those visits?" Mrs. Havers folded a pillowcase with a little too much force. "He always took a walk afterwards. Long ones, silent." Miss Marple nodded. "And the last time she came?" "About 10 days ago. Early evening. He didn't eat supper that night, just sat at the window." There was a pause. A log cracked in the hearth. "Did he leave behind any papers?" Miss Marple asked casually. "No diary, just a few receipts. One address, scribbled on a matchbook, threw it in the fire." Miss Marple glanced at the mantel. A cigarette case sat tucked between a porcelain clock and a brass letter opener, silver, worn at the corners. She gestured to it. "That his?" Mrs. Havers followed her gaze. "Funny, that he never smoked in here. Always stepped outside." Miss Marple stepped closer. The initials on the case were faint. ARP, not Ambrose Pollock, unless the R stood for something unknown. She opened it gently. One cigarette remained, slim, foreign, with a gold band at the filter. A woman's cigarette. "Did he smoke these?" Mrs. Havers frowned. "No, he always smoked Turkish, those rough ones, in the blue tin. That's not his." Miss Marple closed the case and handed it over. "You should give that to Sergeant Beale." Later that afternoon, Constable Whitcomb came knocking at Miss Marple's cottage, cap soaked and cheeks pink from the cold. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple. We followed up on your comment about items left under the pew. And we found this." He produced a small felt pouch green with an embroidered leaf stitched at the edge. Inside was a brooch, a cameo, cracked slightly at the edge. The clasp was broken. "Any idea whose it might be?" Miss Marple examined it thoughtfully. "Not his style," she murmured. "No sign he's be wearing it. But I did see it once, at the last Women's Guild tea." Whitcomb raised an eyebrow. "A woman sits then?" "Yes, it belonged to Mrs. Fenella Cates, the station master set's wife." "Just so. She was sitting behind Mr. Pollock during the service. She wore that brooch on her coat. I remember because it had a small thread loose at the shoulder. You think she dropped it? I think, Miss Marple said carefully. It fell, but I doubt it slipped without some struggle. Whitcomb stared. You mean she was involved? Miss Marple Sit's voice was gentle. I only mean, dear, that the brooch wasn't sit under her pew. It was under his. That evening, Miss Marple sat by the fire with her knitting in her lap, though she hadn't stitched a row in 20 minutes. Mr. Pollock had lied about something. She was sure of it. Not in words, but in presence. He had lived like a man watching his back. The visitor in gloves, the strange cigarette, a cameo brooch under his bench. Too many signs, and not enough explanation. She rose, moved to her writing desk, and took out a small notebook. She scribbled 3 names. Mrs. Fenella Cates. The unnamed woman in the brown car. R.P. Then, beneath them, she added a single question. What was he running from? Chapter 4. The morning fog had scarcely lifted when Miss Marple stepped into the station master's garden, the frozen ground crunching softly beneath her feet. Fenella Cates was trimming back her rose bushes in a pair of worn gardening gloves, though it was far too late in the season for such tasks. A diversion, Miss Marple thought. People often busied themselves when they had something on their minds. Good morning, Fenella, she called pleasantly. Mrs. Cates looked up, startled, and then forced a smile. Oh, Miss Marple, do forgive me. I wasn't expecting company. Not company, Miss Marple said, approaching slowly. Just a neighbor with a few questions. Fenella hesitated, then removed her gloves. Her coat was buttoned up to the chin, though her hands were bare and red with cold. Miss Marple noted the absence of any brooch on her lapel. You left the service rather quickly on Christmas morning, she began gently. Yes, I wasn't feeling quite myself. A dreadful thing, poor Mr. Pollock. Such an unexpected passing. Fenella swallowed and nodded. It was shocking. I suppose that's why I can quite recall everything clearly. Perfectly natural, Miss Marple said, though I imagine you were sitting quite near him. Mrs. Cates flinched almost imperceptibly. 1 pew behind? And I believe you were wearing a cameo brooch that day. A lovely one. Cream and coral, set in silver. Fenella Sit's eyes widened. Why? Yes, I always wear it to church. It was my mother Sit's. Miss Marple gave a small nod. Then it might surprise you to learn it was found beneath Mr. Pollock Sit's pew. Clasp broken. There was a long pause. Fenella Sit's fingers twisted together. I must have lost it during the service. I must have lost it during the service. Perhaps I leaned forward, and it caught on something. Perhaps, Miss Marple said softly, or perhaps there was a moment of contact. The silence stretched. At last, Fenella sank onto the garden bench, face pale. It wasn't what you think. I don't think anything yet, dear. I simply ask questions. Fenella looked down at her hands. He wasn't who he claimed to be, Miss Marple. I knew it the first time I saw him. Oh, he used to go by another name. In London. Arnold Rivers. Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but inwardly she filed the information alongside the engraved ARP cigarette case. I seen him at the theatre where my sister worked. She was a dresser for the actors. He was charming, too charming. She told me he ruined a girl there, not with force. He just promised things, lied, took what he wanted. I see. I didn't say anything at first, but when I saw him here, blending in, pretending, I was angry. I confronted him at the church, just before the service. That's six when it happened. What happened? I grabbed his sleeve. He tried to laugh it off, called it a misunderstanding. But I told him I knew what he said done, and I told him I said I'd speak to the vicar, maybe the police. He changed, Miss Marple. His whole face, not angry, just frightened. And then I turned away, sat behind him. My brooch must have fallen then. I never noticed. Miss Marple studied her for a long moment. Did he threaten you? No. But I think someone else knew about him. Someone who's been hurt worse than I had. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited Sergeant Beale at the temporary station post set up in the back room of the village hall. I said a name for you, she said, without preamble. Arnold Rivers Pollock. Formerly just Arnold Rivers, I believe. Beale raised an eyebrow and scribbled the name down. That would explain the initials on the cigarette case, and perhaps the reason for his abrupt move to St. Mildred's sets. He was hiding, Sergeant. Beale sat back in his chair. Funny thing, we ran his prints this morning, just in case. And you sit right. He sits not who he claimed had a charge for fraud about 5 years back. London District. Charges were dropped. Lack of witness cooperation. Convenient. Too convenient. Miss Marple tapped the table gently. I suspect that witness may be the mystery woman who visited him. Still no name. Not yet. But I believe she drove a brown motor car and wore gloves at all times. Mrs. Havers remembered the gloves. Always the gloves. Beale frowned, like she was hiding something? Perhaps not hiding so much as protecting, but from what or whom we sip yet to learn. That evening, Miss Marple sat with her knitting once more, the fire crackling softly beside her. She recalled Fenella Cates's clenched fingers, the flush of shame and fear as she spoke. It had not been guilt, but recognition, and something else. Miss Marple's 6 eyes narrowed. If Pollock had a history of manipulation, there could be others, people with far more to lose than a sister's heartbreak. And those people, she suspected, might not rely on broken brooches or hushed threats. They might act more decisively. Chapter 5. The next morning brought a brittle sun and an unexpected visitor. Miss Marple had just finished arranging her seed catalogues when a polite knock echoed through the cottage. Upon opening the door, she found young Constable Whitcomb standing awkwardly on the step, clutching a brown envelope and looking slightly flushed from the walk. "I thought you want to see this, Miss Marple," he said, holding out the envelope. Came from the coroner's office, among Mr. Pollock's personal effects. She accepted it with a nod, motioned him inside, and set out tea as she opened the envelope with careful fingers. Inside was a single black and white photograph, slightly creased at the corner. A woman stood beside a car, an older model Humber, with her hand resting lightly on the door. Her face was turned partly from the camera, but there was a striking grace about her, tall, elegant, gloved. Her hat cast a partial shadow, but not enough to obscure a sharp jawline and the suggestion of an amused smile. "No name on the back," Whitcomb said, but Mrs. Havers confirmed she looks like the visitor. Same coat, same gloves. Miss Marple studied the image. She sits younger than I expected. Mid-30s perhaps, and quite composed for someone photographed in what must have been a candid moment. Could be a companion, or a blackmailer? Miss Marple sits eyebrows lifted slightly. Oh, I doubt she was after money. Whitcomb blinked. Why sits that? She visited twice, quietly, never asked questions in the village, left no letters, made no contact after the death. A blackmailer leaves a trace. A woman protecting something does not. Whitcomb sat forward. So you think she knew what was coming? I think she feared it, but I also think she cared for Mr. Pollock, despite what he may have done. Whitcomb looked unconvinced. He had enemies. Mrs. Cates was half ready to report him. Yes, but she didn't study kill him. Fenella is hurt, not vengeful. She came close to exposing him, but fear held her back. It steadied someone else we must understand. Someone who had far more at stake. Miss Marple tapped the photograph. This woman. She is the key. By late afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the village library, a small but tidy building tucked behind the post office. She was not interested in books today, but in local newspaper archives, a habit she had relied upon for decades, more revealing than most police reports. After an hour of flipping through editions from 5 years prior, something caught her eye. It was a notice in the Much Norley Herald, dated late November. Arnold Rivers, formerly of the Hayworth Players, acquitted of fraud charges following witness retraction. Beneath the headline was a courtroom sketch, and though the lines were rough, there was no mistaking the figure seated in the public gallery, hand-gloved, even in the courtroom, her chin tilted toward the dock. The same woman. No name mentioned, but another detail leapt out. The caption beneath the sketch, "Unidentified female companion refused to testify." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She whispered the words aloud, barely audible. Refused to testify. Back in her cottage, she returned to her notebook and drew a line beneath the previous names. Then added a new entry. Unidentified woman appeared in courtroom sketch, Much Norley Herald, November 5th. Gloves. Refused to testify. Returned twice to visit Pollock. And below that, a new question. Was she protecting him or someone else? That evening, Miss Marple attended the Women's Guild supper at the parish hall, a post-Christmas affair with weak coffee and stronger opinions. But her real aim was conversation. She caught sight of Mrs. Alderney lingering near the cake table, eyeing a slice of ginger loaf with more suspicion than appetite. "Hetty," Miss Marple said brightly, "you sev a sharp memory for faces, haven't set you?" Mrs. Alderney flushed with pleasure. "Oh, I do try. Facial symmetry, you know, it always stays with me." Miss Marple lowered her voice. "Would you look at something for me?" She produced the photograph from her bag. Mrs. Alderney took one glance and gasped. "Well, I never. That's it, Vivienne Lamont." "You said sure." "Quite. She was in the repertory company that came through last summer. Played Lady Windermere Sits Fan at the town hall in Norley. Stunning presence. Voice like silk." Miss Marple Sitter's eyes glinted. "Did you meet her?" "Briefly. My niece worked backstage. Said Vivienne was sweet, but rather private. Always wore gloves. Said they were for a skin condition." Miss Marple gave a slight smile. Curious how many people develop those when they wish to conceal fingerprints. That night, she returned home with the name etched firmly in her thoughts. Vivienne Lamont. The woman who stood beside the car. The woman who'd refused to testify. The woman who had visited Pollock twice, but not after his death. A part of her mourned the logic of it. A woman like Vivienne could have loved a man like Pollock or hated him. or both. But love, Miss Marple knew, could drive the quietest hearts to the most decisive acts. Chapter 6. On the edge of Norley, past the high street and beyond the railway yard, sat a modest boarding house called the Braxley. The bricks were clean, the curtains drawn, and a faint scent of lavender hung in the foyer. Miss Marple, having phoned ahead under the guise of tracing a distant cousin from St. Ives, had secured an appointment with the landlady, a Miss Evelyn Groves. She kept room 3 for the past 4 months. Miss Groves explained, leading Miss Marple up the creaky staircase. Polite, pays weekly in cash. No callers. Quiet, really. Almost too quiet. Miss Marple nodded, her expression pleasant. Did she say what brought her to Norley? Not much. Said she needed rest and distance, artistic temperament, I thought. One of those dramatic types, though not a bit theatrical in person. They stopped outside a closed door. Miss Groves knocked gently. Miss Lamont. A visitor. No response. Groves tried again. Miss Lamont. It's Evelyn. I'm just bringing someone up from the village. She says she may know your cousin in Cornwall. Miss Marple? There was a pause. Then the door clicked open. Vivienne Lamont stood before them, pale and composed, one gloved hand on the doorframe. She had changed little from the photograph, taller in person, with a finely drawn face and eyes that seemed to see too much. "Thank you, Miss Groves," she said calmly. "I still speak to her here." The landlady offered a polite smile and withdrew. Miss Marple stepped inside. The room was orderly. Suitcase tucked beneath the bed, a single vase of chrysanthemums on the dresser, and a silk scarf draped carefully over the mirror. On the nightstand sat a small silver case. Miss Marple noted the initials VL. Vivienne gestured to the armchair. "You not from Cornwall?" "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But I am from St. Mildred Sets, and I believe we share an interest in the late Mr. Pollock." A flicker crossed Vivienne's face, gone as quickly as it appeared. "I don't know that name. He used to go by Arnold Rivers." Vivienne closed the door with a soft click. "Then you know more than I expected." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "Not nearly enough, my dear. But I hope you still help me change that." Vivienne crossed to the window and looked out. "I suppose I always knew it would instead end quietly. Not for him, but I did instead think it would be quite so final." "You loved him." Vivienne didn't answer immediately. "I thought I did, once, and later. I pitied him." Miss Marple let the silence settle. Vivienne turned. "He was charming, brilliant, persuasive, but selfish and frightened. I saw that early on. He could make you believe the world owed him forgiveness. But when things went wrong, he vanished." "Did he leave someone behind?" Vivienne Lestet's voice dropped. "A girl, younger than me. He promised to marry her, then emptied her savings and left her family to bear the shame. She didn't survive it." Sorry. "She was my sister." Miss Marple felt the weight of the words. "You went to the trial. I wanted to see him face the truth, but the law failed her. I couldn't testify, not without exposing my family's pain, so I stayed silent, and he walked free. And then came to St. Mildred Sets. I followed him at first to confront him, but when I saw him in that church, listless alone, I couldn't decide whether to hate him or mourn him." "You visited him twice?" Vivienne nodded. "He seemed afraid, kept looking over his shoulder, said someone was threatening him." Miss Marple gaze sharpened. Did he say who? No names, just hints that something from the past was catching up. Did you believe him? Vivienne hesitated.
Yes.
But not because he deserved pity, because he looked like a man who finally understood what it was to live in fear. Did you poison him? Vivienne met her eyes. No. The words were firm, quiet, unflinching. Miss Marple believed her. Did you notice anyone watching him? Vivienne nodded slowly. There was a man. I saw him once, outside the cottage. Average height, thick overcoat, wore a cap low over his eyes. I thought he was watching me, but now I think it was Arnold. Could you describe him? Not well, but he moved like someone used to keeping out of sight. Miss Marple sat back. It's helpful. Thank you. Vivienne crossed her arms. Do you think they still blame me? No, but they may come knocking. Vivienne gave a soft laugh. Then let them. Miss Marple rose. If I were you, keep the gloves off for now, and the suitcase packed. As she left, Vivienne's voice stopped her. You think it was someone else then? Yes, Miss Marple said quietly. Someone who didn't need to threaten him, just needed to wait. That evening, Miss Marple walked home beneath a sky dimming to pewter. Her thoughts were sharp, circling. Vivienne had motive. So had Fenella Cates, but both had left signs of conscience, of restraint. The killer had left no such signs. And that frightened her more than anything, because it meant that whoever had done it hadn't acted in anger or fear, but with precision. Chapter 7. By mid-morning the following day, a fine rain was falling over St. Mildred's, soft enough to melt into the hedgerows without noise. The vicarage kitchen was warm and fragrant with orange peel and cloves as Mrs. Kettle prepared her traditional post-Christmas preserves. Miss Marple sat at the table, hands wrapped around a steaming cup of Ceylon tea, her expression quietly thoughtful. The visit was not social, though it appeared so on the surface. The vicar's wife had always been forthcoming in her way, especially when gently encouraged with polite curiosity and a plate of shortbread. I still can believe it, Mrs. Kettle said, wiping her hands on a checked apron. Poor Mr. Pollock, such a quiet man, who have thought. Miss Marple stirred her tea without drinking. He sat in the same pew every Sunday, didn't he? Oh yes, 5th row, left side, always punctual, never lingered afterward. Odd, in retrospect. Did he ever attend any of the village events? The fête? The harvest supper? Mrs. Kettle shook her head. Not once, always polite when asked, but always declined. He did have tea here once, though. A few weeks after he arrived, the vicar insisted. And did anything stand out? Mrs. Kettle hesitated, then gave a small nod. Well, yes, actually. He broke a teacup. Oh, one of the good ones too. Part of my mother's set slipped right from his fingers. But what struck me was how upset he was. Not in a social embarrassment sort of way, truly rattled, pale as a sheet. I said it was nothing, but he left soon after. Do you recall which cup it was? Mrs. Kettle turned and opened the cabinet. These Royal Stafford, daisies and little blue forget-me-nots, except this one. She held out a cup with a fine crack running from rim to handle. I kept it. Sentimental, I suppose. Miss Marple took it gently, examining the inside. A hairline chip at the lip, barely visible. She turned it in her fingers, and there, just inside the base, was something else no bigger than a pinhead, a faint residue, oddly waxy in texture. "Have you washed this since?" "Only once, gently by hand." Miss Marple gave a quiet, "Might I borrow it for a short time? I know a gentleman in Norley who may be able to test the interior glaze." Mrs. Kettle blinked. "You don't think? I think Mr. Pollock's fear may have begun long before Christmas morning." By early afternoon, the rain had turned to mist, and Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to Dr. Anstruther's surgery. He was a reserved man, but curious by nature, which often made him useful. She presented the cracked cup with its faint residue. "Would you mind testing the inside?" she asked. "Specifically for any alkaloid traces, plant-based poisons, something easily dissolved in hot liquid." Anstruther raised an eyebrow but agreed. "Could take a day or two." "I appreciate it." As she turned to go, he added, "You think someone tried before the church?" "I think someone might have been practicing." Later that day, word drifted through the village that Sergeant Beale had been to the cottage again. According to the butcher's wife, who had it from Mrs. Hever's, who had it from her nephew, they had found a torn envelope beneath the floorboards of the small study. It was scorched at the edges but bore the unmistakable seal of a solicitor's office in London. Miss Marple received this news from Clara Winchell, who had nearly tripped over herself to bring it to her door. "Fancy that," Clara huffed. "You hide letters, you hide something worse. Don't set you think." "I imagine so," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Did they find anything inside?" "Bits of a will, I heard, or maybe a threat. No one sits quite sure. The sergeant took it away, under his coat." Miss Marple made note of it. If Pollock had received a letter worth hiding, it suggested a very recent pressure or a sudden shift in control. She thought again of Vivienne's words. He seemed afraid someone was threatening him. But who? She sat back, reviewing it all in her mind. Fenella Cates had motive. Vivienne Lamont had opportunity. Yet neither woman showed signs of execution. Miss Marple had learned long ago that murder, true murder, was rarely committed by the desperate. It was committed by the calculated. Someone had wanted Mr. Pollock dead, not out of passion, but purpose. Someone who had observed him long enough to study his habits. Someone who had tested the method before Christmas. Someone close enough to deliver a final, invisible blow in public, unnoticed. She glanced out the window. Not every killer needed a dark alley or a pistol. Sometimes, all they needed was a pew and a teacup. Chapter 8. On the Thursday after Christmas, the village green was still slick with melting frost when Miss Marple received an unexpected visit from young Thomas Biddle, one of the smaller choir boys, all freckles and wool mittens, with a tendency to speak far too quickly when nervous. He had knocked twice before she opened the door, his cheeks flushed and his cap askew. "Miss Marple, I think I remembered something from church. When Mr. Pollock, She ushered him in at once, setting him near the fire with a biscuit and a warm cup of cocoa. "Now, take a breath, dear. No need to be anxious." Thomas gripped the mug in both hands. "I didn't think it was important at first. But Mr. Whitcomb told us at rehearsal yesterday that if we saw anything strange, we ought to say. Very wise." He looked at her, eyes wide. "So I thought about it, and I remembered something. About the cup." Miss Marple sit's brow lifted. "The cup?" "Yes, the communion cup." The silver one. For the Christmas service. Mr. Pollock took it. He always did. He sat on the left, you see, and Reverend Kettle always came that way. I see. But it wasn't the usual one. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Go on. I noticed it because it was duller, not shiny like the others. The vicar always polishes them, but this one had a sort of film on the rim. A film. Thomas nodded. Not dirt. More like wax. I didn't stay anything. I thought maybe I imagined it. Do you recall where it went after? Thomas frowned. Mrs. Kettle took it with the rest to the sacristy. I saw her. I only remembered because it left a smudge on her gloves. Miss Marple gave a small nod, the corners of her mouth tightening just slightly. Thank you, Thomas. That was very helpful. You have quite a sharp eye. He beamed with pride, slurped his cocoa, and darted off a moment later with promises to tell no one else. Miss Marple sat in thought. She had assumed the fatal dose, if it had been poison, was in tea. But what if it had come from a more sacred source? That afternoon, she returned to the church, where she found Reverend Kettle in his study, sorting sermon notes and looking profoundly weary. I wonder, she said gently, if I might ask to see the communion vessels used last Sunday. The vicar blinked. You mean the chalices? Yes, especially the one used for the left side pews. He hesitated. Is this part of the inquiry, Miss Marple? In a manner of speaking. With a puzzled frown, he led her to the sacristy. A carved cabinet held the cups, 4 in all, lined with linen. 3 gleamed. The 4th was slightly duller. Miss Marple examined the rim closely. Even in the poor light, a faint residue remained near the lip, barely visible, but waxy. She touched the cloth beneath it. A fine grey smear. Reverend, she said softly, do you polish these yourself? Always. Except, well, that one I left on the vestry table Saturday evening. I meant to do it last, but I must forgotten. Was the church unlocked at any time after that? He flushed. I left the vestry door open briefly on Sunday morning to fetch a hymnal. I was only gone 5 minutes. Miss Marple nodded. Just long enough. She gently took a tissue from her bag and blotted the rim. I still see that this is tested. That evening, as the fire crackled in her parlour, Miss Marple laid out her notes. Vivienne Lamont had motive but no access to the communion vessels. Fenella Cates had anger. But would she poison a chalice? Mrs. Kettle had handled the cup, but had no reason to target Pollock. The vicar himself? Kind-hearted, disorganized, but unskilled in subterfuge. And yet, someone had entered that vestry, quietly, deliberately. Miss Marple thought again of the torn solicitor's letter, of the unfamiliar name, and of the teacup Pollock had broken during his visit to the vicarage. She drew a line beside that entry. What had he seen or feared during that tea? She turned to the list of confirmed facts. The brooch beneath the pew. Kate's. The gloved visitor, Vivienne. The photograph, Vivienne. The tainted communion cup used only by Pollock. The cigarette case, ARP. The will fragments, burnt and hidden. The chipped teacup residue, pending analysis. The man in the overcoat, unknown. She circled the last. It was time, she thought, to find someone who'd been watching everyone, not from anger or revenge, but for something more specific. Timing. Chapter 9. It was not until the following morning, while speaking with Mr. George Lytton, retired solicitor and loyal occupier of the library's corner armchair, that Miss Marple made the connection. They sat by the hearth in the reading room, where the fire popped agreeably, and the smell of scorched toast from the caretaker's flat hung faintly in the air. Mr. Lytton had been talking at length about the late Mr. Pollock's curious reclusiveness. "I knew something was off from the beginning," he declared. "Never once asked about parish council matters. Didn't even express an opinion about the road paving." "That is strange," Miss Marple murmured, "especially for a man claiming to want peace and stability." Mr. Lytton leaned forward. "And he had a visitor, you know. A man in an overcoat, sat across from the greengrocer 6, reading the same paper every Tuesday." Miss Marple's teacup paused mid-air. "You saw him yourself?" "Indeed. A tall fellow. Stiff shoulders. Looked like former military, I did say. Neat gloves. Didn't buy anything. Just observed. Always glanced toward the Tithe Cottage." "How long did this go on?" 3, maybe 4 weeks. Then he vanished. Just after Christmas. Day before, that Friday, I believe." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, and no one spoke to him. He wasn't exactly approachable, had the sort of air that discouraged conversation. She thanked Mr. Lytton and left the library slowly, her thoughts moving faster than her steps. Someone had been watching, patiently, calculatingly, long enough to know Pollock's movements, church habits, even which pew he sat in. But why? By noon, she was at the temporary police post again, where Sergeant Beale now had his sleeves rolled to the elbows and a map of the village pinned with small coloured tacks. "I might have something," Miss Marple said gently, and proceeded to recount Mr. Lytton's observation. Beale frowned. "Why haven't I heard about this?" "Because Mr. Lytton only notices what he finds socially unusual. A man loitering quietly with a newspaper doesn't quite rise to scandal unless he fails to express an opinion about roadworks." Beale gave a grudging smile. "Point taken. Any ideas who he is?" "Only this. A man who watches rather than acts is likely gathering information. He sits waiting for something specific." "Or someone," Beale added. Miss Marple nodded. "Could you check with the station master, Mr. Cates? Perhaps this man arrived regularly by train. Same time each week. And if he vanished the day before Christmas, perhaps he boarded the last Friday train." Beale scratched his chin. "I still send Whitcomb down this afternoon. And Sergeant," she added, pausing at the door, "have your men dust the chalice again, this time for wax traces. I believe it was prepared outside the church." At the station, Mr. Cates was unusually taciturn. After much coaxing by Whitcomb and one firm cup of railway tea, he confirmed that a gentleman matching the description had indeed taken the 4:40 train to Norley on Friday. Tall, clean-shaven, wore gloves, had the air of someone who travels light but thinks heavy, Cates had said, tapping the ledger. "Paid in cash," he added. "But I remember him because he asked about Christmas services, whether they were well attended." Whitcomb returned to Beale with the news just as Miss Marple was sipping her afternoon Darjeeling. "Then we have a timeline," Beale said, piecing it together. He observed Pollock for weeks, knew where he sit, perhaps even his habits. Came the day before, prepped something in the vestry. Slipped away before morning. And yet, Miss Marple murmured, he didn't know enough. Not really. Beale looked up. Why not? because if he set known Pollock well, truly well, he set have known that Pollock always drank tea after church, at the vicarage, or alone, he would have chosen that, not the chalice, which suggests Deal's eyes widened. He wasn't stashed after Pollock. Miss Marple gave a small nod, but he poisoned him anyway. That evening, Miss Marple reviewed her notes one last time. The man in the overcoat had planned something, but not necessarily the murder of Arnold Rivers. Was it a warning, a test, or a miscalculation? She looked again at the solicitor Sepson's envelope, burnt but not entirely destroyed. A name had been faintly retrieved from the edge. Douglas R. Not Rivers. Something else. She stared hard at the letters. Douglas Rowntree. The name meant nothing to most but Miss Marple, who read footnotes and remembered forgotten headlines, recalled it well. Douglas Rowntree had been acquitted of embezzlement 5 years ago. The same year Rivers' fraud case collapsed. Different trials, same firm. Different victims. Unless... Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She turned to a clean sheet in her notebook and wrote, Douglas Rowntree, =, the man Pollock framed. He disappears. Pollock re-emerges under new name. And then someone begins watching, waiting. She closed the notebook slowly. It was no longer a question of who had killed Pollock. It was who he had replaced, and who had come back for justice. Chapter 10. The last of the Christmas wreaths had begun to brown at the edges, curling inward as if in quiet withdrawal. Mildred's wore its wintry hush well, though something uneasy had taken root beneath the calm, the sort of tension that only Miss Marple could feel gathering, like the breath before a storm. By now whispers of poison and falsified names had worked their way into the back rooms and tea shops, though no one dared speak of it directly. The official word remained, sudden death, pending results. But the village knew, they always did. And on this particular morning, Miss Marple's path led her quietly, purposefully, to the Cates household. Fenella answered the door in her gardening smock, clearly surprised. Miss Marple, is everything? Just a few clarifying questions, dear. Miss Marple said with her usual gentle smile. May I? Fenella hesitated, then stepped aside. Of course. They settled in the parlour. The fire had been left untended, and the chill in the air gave the conversation a certain sharpness. You told me, Miss Marple began, that you confronted Mr. Pollock in the church before the Christmas service. Yes. And that you sat directly behind him. That set's correct. Miss Marple tilted her head. You said you grabbed his sleeve, that your brooch must have fallen during that interaction. Fenella nodded once stiffly. And yet, Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Mrs. Weatherby recalled seeing you arrive with your coat buttoned up. The brooch wasn't set visible at all. Fenella's expression froze. Miss Marple pressed gently. You see, I had thought it a simple lapse of memory, but then I spoke to Thomas Biddle, the choir boy. He remembered something odd, said that during the blessing you weren't sat in your pew at all. He noticed the space. It caught his eye because the other pews were full, and yours was suddenly empty. Fenella swallowed. Miss Marple's voice dropped. So, dear, I must ask, where were you during those final minutes of the service? A long silence. Then quietly, I went to the vestry. Miss Marple nodded slowly. I thought as much. Fenella stood, wrapped her arms around herself. It was only for a moment. I hadn't meant anything by it. Why go? I thought I saw him, Pollock, go back there earlier. Just before the service started, I followed, curious, but when I got there, he was gone. I noticed the communion vessels were left out. I thought it odd. Then I heard the choir begin, and I left. You didn't tell anyone? I was afraid, Fenella whispered. I didn't want to be accused of anything. I was angry with him, yes. But I never touched those cups, Miss Marple. I swear it. Miss Marple rose and placed a reassuring hand on her arm. I believe you. But you must understand, you placed yourself at the heart of the mystery, and not by accident. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the window, watching the chimney smoke drift across the rooftops. Fenella had slipped, not fatally, but enough to raise one final question. Who else knew the vestry would be unattended? She opened her notebook once more and added a name she had not expected to return to Reverend Amos Kettle. Not because he was guilty, but because he had left the door open. And only someone intimately familiar with the church's rhythms could have known that 5 minutes was all it would take. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited Dr. Anstruther's office, where he greeted her with an envelope and a grave expression. Your instincts were correct. Trace alkaloids in the teacup, minute, barely detectable. But present. Similar compound to what was found in the communion cup. Near identical. Miss Marple let out a soft breath. 2 attempts, then. The first a test, the second precision. Someone had known exactly what they were doing. She stepped outside into the cool afternoon. The truth was taking shape, inevitable, chilling, and all that remained was to press one final corner of the web. She would start with Vivienne Lamont. Miss Marple met her on the footpath just beyond Norley's Green, where Vivienne was walking alone, gloved hands tucked into her coat pockets. I hoped you might come, Vivienne said softly. I heard things, enough to know it's nearly finished. It is. They walked a few steps together, before Miss Marple asked, Did Arnold ever mention the name Douglas Rowntree? Vivienne stopped. Yes, years ago, he was the man he blamed, said he'd been betrayed, lied about, that Rowntree had stolen money and made it look like Arnold Tepter's fault. And did you believe him? Vivienne Sebet's gaze was steady. Then, yes. Now, no. Miss Marple studied her. He reinvented himself, moved here. He'd earned behind politeness and silence, but someone found him. Vivienne sat, breath clouded in the cold air. Then it was him, Rowntree. Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. I believe Rowntree died 3 years ago, she said at last. An obituary, unremarkable. London Coroner Sit's office, but I believe he had a brother. Vivienne Sett's brow furrowed, and the brother came here. Miss Marple nodded, watched, waited, observed the vestry left unguarded, slipped in, coated the communion cup with a measured dose, and vanished before dawn. Vivienne was silent for a long moment. Do you know who he is? I will, very soon. Because now, Miss Marple thought, it was not about who had motive. It was about who had access, discipline, and a reason to wait 5 years to deliver justice under the guise of worship. And only one man had watched without reacting. Only one had returned to the scene again and again. She turned toward the road that led to the station. Chapter 11. The Norley station office smelled faintly of coal dust and damp wool, It was not often visited by outsiders, and certainly not by Miss Marple, who appeared just after the midday train rumbled through, tapping her umbrella lightly as she entered. Station Master Edgar Cates looked up from his ledger, blinking in mild surprise. "Miss Marple," he said, straightening. "Nothing wrong, I hope?" "Nothing new, Mr. Cates," she replied cheerfully. "But I come to ask about something quite old, namely your December rail logs, in particular Friday the 23rd. He looked hesitant. "It's rather unusual, miss." "I understand, but I believe the answer to something dreadful may lie in that day. Sip's names. The late Mr. Pollock was killed 2 days later, and someone left the village on that Friday afternoon. Someone very quiet. Someone who didn't want to be remembered." At that, Edgar Cates's gaze darkened, and after a beat, he turned and pulled a heavy leather-bound ledger from a shelf behind the counter. He placed it on the desk, flipped to the marked date, and rotated the book toward her. "There," he said, tapping a column. "4 single-fare cash tickets issued for the 4:40 to Norley. One woman, I recall, Vivienne Lamont. She gave a name. The others didn't set." Miss Marple Sip's eyes scanned the page. One was blank, one illegible, and the third read, "Richard R." She tapped it once. "Would you happen to recall him?" Cates frowned, thinking, quiet man, trim coat, black gloves, didn't speak much, just asked about the service schedules, said he might be coming back after the holiday, but he didn't instead. "Did he give anything else? A full name?" "No, just the R. Said he was travelling light, no luggage, seemed like he knew the village well enough." Miss Marple gave a small smile. "I believe he did." Back in St. Mildred, Sue, she went straight to the police post, where Sergeant Beale was seated with Constable Whitcomb, poring over a map and the recent test results. "Trace of wax confirmed," Beale said before she could speak, "on the communion cup and the cloth." "You were right. It was applied externally." "And likely very precisely," Miss Marple said. "With care, not haste." She handed over a slip of paper. "From the Norley station ledger, the passenger who left on Friday, Richard R." Beale scanned the name. "Doesn't stet help us much?" "It might," Miss Marple replied calmly. "If you cross-reference with the London Gazette archives, search for Douglas Rowntree Sip's legal case and any mention of family members, particularly a brother. Perhaps one with medical training." Beale blinked. "Medical? A layperson wouldn't it know how to dose a chalice with alkaloid poison in such a way that it would go undetected, but a former medic or someone with pharmaceutical training might." Beale was already reaching for his notepad. "I Stulwire Norley." The reply came the next morning. "Douglas Rowntree. Survived by one brother, Dr. Richard Rowntree, formerly employed at Wellington Sanatorium, resigned his post 4 years ago under uncertain circumstances. Last known address unlisted." Miss Marple read the telegram once, then folded it carefully. "Dr. Richard R.," she murmured. "Who waited? Who studied? Who bided his time until he was certain that the man who ruined his brother was vulnerable?" Beale Stew's face was grim. "He may have disappeared again." "I doubt it," Miss Marple said, "because such men don't vanish. They hide in plain sight. Quiet, unobtrusive, always watching." She looked toward the church tower, where a familiar figure was adjusting the bell ropes. The assistant verger, Mr. Alton Reeves, a tall, silent man, who'd come to the village just over a year ago, claimed to be retired from city work, had taken quickly to the routines of church life, quiet, polite, and always present. Even at the Christmas service, stationed in the back, eyes everywhere. Later that day, Miss Marple walked into St. Mildred's with purpose. The nave was empty, the candles unlit. Mr. Reeves was in the side chapel, sorting the vestments into their protective sleeves. He turned as she approached, but did not smile. "Miss Marple, can I help you?" "Perhaps," she said. "You've been very helpful this past year, so organized, never one to miss a service. It sets my duty. And you know the vestry well, I expect. Its schedules, when it sits left unlocked." He straightened, the faintest pause in his movement. "I suppose so." She watched him for a long moment. "Douglas Rowntree," she said quietly. "He was your brother." Reeves said nothing. The stillness was heavy. Miss Marple continued. "He trusted a man who ruined him. The court let that man walk free. Your brother died 2 years later, but you didn't forget." Reeves looked down at his hands. "You can understand." "I understand more than you think." She stepped closer. "You didn't start it kill in anger. You waited, learned his habits, found a way to do it that left no mark." Reeves's voice was low. "He wouldn't repent. Even when I confronted him, he laughed. Instead he never remember my brother's name." "And so," Miss Marple said gently, "you left your message in the one place he stood feel safest, the church." Silence. "Then, are you going to tell them?" "Yes." She placed a hand on his sleeve. "But I will also tell them the truth, that it was not madness or revenge. It was justice, terribly cold, but still justice." He didn't resist as she led him out. Chapter 12. The news moved through St. Mildred's, not like a storm, but like a snowfall, soft, quiet, inevitable. Mr. Alton Reeves, the assistant verger, had been taken into custody for questioning regarding the death of Mr. Ambrose Pollock. By the end of the day, it was widely accepted that his real name was Dr. Richard Rowntree. Sergeant Beale confirmed it 2 mornings later, holding the signed confession in his hand like a fragile relic. "He said he waited years," Beale told Miss Marple as they walked along the frost-laced green. "Tracked Pollock here, saw the name change, knew no one else would see through the new identity. He considered many ways, but it was the church that offered him the cleanest stage." Miss Marple nodded, her breath clouding in the air. "He didn't act in heat. That's what made it so precise, so quiet." "He even attended the funeral preparations," Beale muttered. "Read the scripture without a flicker. That's what chills me." "And yet," Miss Marple said softly, "he never intended to hurt anyone else. He waited until Pollock drank alone from the chalice. No one else touched it. He tested the method on a teacup, measured everything." Beale exhaled slowly. "He said it was the only way to balance what happened to his brother." "There is no true balance in these things," Miss Marple replied. "Only weight shifted from one heart to another." The funeral for Mr. Pollock was held 3 days after the final confession. It was sparsely attended. Miss Marple sat near the back. Vivienne Lamont arrived quietly, dressed in navy with a simple veil. She took a seat in the second pew, but did not cry. Reverend Kettle gave a solemn homily about the mystery of redemption, the difference between forgiveness and forgetting. It was beautifully worded, if not entirely comforting. Afterward, Miss Marple approached Vivienne just outside the porch, where the wind lifted the corner of her veil like a farewell. He lied to many, Vivienne said before Miss Marple could speak, but in the end, I think he truly feared what he became. Miss Marple touched her arm gently. We all fear that now and then. They said no more, but as Vivienne stepped back toward the road, she paused and offered a quiet thank you before vanishing into the soft hush of winter. In the weeks that followed, the village slowly resumed its ordinary rhythm. Mr. Letton began lobbying again for road improvements. Clara Winchell wrote a lengthy article for the parish newsletter titled Reflections on the Pew Left Empty. Mrs. Kettle rejoined the tea rota with a renewed sense of duty, though she never again used the cracked teacup. At her cottage, Miss Marple finished her knitting, folded it neatly, and placed it beside a stack of letters unanswered since before Christmas. She sat for a moment, watching the light shift across the mantelpiece. The truth had come, not like a gavel, but like a bell, quietly rung, heard most clearly in silence. Arnold Rivers, known in St. Mildred's as Ambrose Pollock, had died not only because of what he had done, but because of what he refused to become. He had built a life on evasion, and in the end someone else had refused to let him slip through unnoticed. Justice had been served, if not in the form the courts would have chosen, and Miss Marple, as always, was left with a strange mix of satisfaction and sorrow. Some days later, she received a small parcel in the post, unmarked save for a London stamp. Inside was a cigarette case. R.P. and beneath it a folded note. For what it set's worth, I never could bring myself to throw it away. Miss Marple turned it in her hand. The surface was smooth, cold, unsentimental. She placed it in her drawer beside a faded brooch and an old church bulletin. Then she reached for her coat and hat. The frost was lifting. The roses would need pruning soon.